Welcome to the Joshua Ngoma podcast for spiritual inspiration and Africa's strategy positioning in global politics.
The IMF and World Bank's Structural Adjustment Programs, SAPs. Since the 1970s, Structural Adjustment Programs, SAPs, were prescribed in many developing economies by the Bretton Woods institutions, namely the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. The programs were imposed as a condition for further loans. SAPs were as a result of the debt crisis that hit the developing countries. In the early 1970s, some oil-producing countries created a united front through the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, and increased their oil price to gain additional revenue. They invested the excess petrodollars in banks in the United States and Europe. In addition, European banks were awash with cash because the Marshall Plan had worked and the economies were growing again. The Marshall Plan was an aid package from the United States worth $13 billion given to Western European nations between 1948 and 1951 to rebuild their economies after World War II. In turn, these banks started lending this excess money to developing countries at low interest rates. The developing countries were then encouraged to use these loans to finance the purchase of machinery, goods and services from the semi-industrialized countries, and in the process, stimulating their production bases. In some developing countries, this cash windfall was borrowed in huge amounts by the political elites and often wasted on luxuries and sustainable white elephant projects, and in some cases, outrightly stolen by the corrupt officials. This honeymoon of easy access to low-interest loans was short-lived. In the early 1980s, the situation drastically changed, with the United States pushing up interest rates in an attempt to beat inflation down in the wake of a severe economic recession. Developing countries that had taken out low-interest loans with U.S. banks now had to pay back with huge interest. European banks also increased interest rates. This was the genesis of Africa's debt crisis. Most of the industrialized world was hit by the severe recession of the early 1980s, including the United States and the United Kingdom. In the United States, the recession was so deep that it was considered at that time as the most significant since the Great Depression of 1929. In 1980, inflation had soared to about 13.5% in the United States. In order to get inflation out of the U.S. economy, then chairman of the Federal Reserve, the Fed, Paul Volcker, slowed the rate of the money supply and raised interest rates. The Fed substantially increased interest rates to reduce inflation. The prime interest rate rose to an epic high of 21.5% by June 1982. In the wake of the 1974 and 1979 energy crises, the inflation rate rose much higher than the rate of economic growth in both the United States and the United Kingdom. In the US, the national average of unemployment reached 10% nationally and 25% in places like Rockford in the state of Illinois. The recession had a severe effect also on the financial institutions, such as the banks and the savings and loans industry. In the United Kingdom, inflation had peaked at 22% and unemployment reached 3 million by January of 1982, a level not seen in 50 years. Britain was once home to the workshop of the world due to its strong manufacturing base. For the first time ever, Britain became a net importer of goods. This was a direct result of losses in the heavy manufacturing industry in areas such as Tyneside, Yorkshire, Merseyside, South Wales, the west of Scotland, and the West Midlands, which were particularly hit. In some of these particular regions, unemployment approached 20%, remained so for a number of years to come, and the national average was at 12.5% by mid-January of 1982. Developing countries soon found out that their debts were unsustainable. They had to take up new loans to service the pre-existing loans to avoid a default that could lead to bankruptcy status. The total foreign debt of developing countries was at about $567 billion in 1980, $1,086 billion in 1986, and $1,419 billion by 1982. Thus, in a period of 12 years, the total debt of developing countries shot up by 250%, and the interest payments amounted to $771 billion, while the principal payments stood at $891 billion. In this same period from 1980 to 1992, these third world countries paid back $1,662 billion, 3 times what they owed in 1980. But because of a high interest rate, the debt still increased to $1,419 billion by 1992. Debt repayments from developing countries are estimated to be at a staggering $443 billion annually in 2022. 75 countries are eligible to borrow from the World Bank's International Development Association, IDA, which supports the poorest countries. IDA eligible countries paid a record of $88.9 billion in debt servicing costs in 2022. The combined external debt of IDA eligible countries hit a high record of $1.1 trillion, which is more than double the 2012 level. From 2012 to 2022, the external debt of IDA eligible countries increased by 134%, overpassing the 53% increase in their gross national income. Hence, debt repayments are a major mechanism of wealth transfer from developing countries to the West. In some instances, the principal amounts of the debts have already paid off, but developing countries remained highly indebted and depend on new loans to service their interest payments. They borrow from Peter to pay John. Here is where the role of the IMF and the World Bank came in. The IMF and the World Bank stepped in by taking up the task of making sure that developing countries continued paying back their debt. They offered new loans to countries that accepted to undergo the Structural Adjustment Program. The disparity in trade under the stipulation of the World Trade Organization, WTO, between the developed and impoverished nations also compounded the problem of poverty. Developing nations could not sell their finished products except certain raw materials on the international market. The original intent of the World Bank was to rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan. After World War II, the International Monetary Fund was to facilitate trade and to make short-term loans available to countries with temporary balance of payment problems. Over time, the World Bank and the IMF have assumed much more power and influence over the economic policies of many countries. About 190 countries make up the membership of these two institutions, but influence exerted on the decision-making process is determined by the amount of subscriptions each member country makes. Since the system is based on $1, one vote, richer countries are the principal shareholders and they command a leading role in determining the policies and direction of the World Bank and the IMF. The two institutions have the power to declare a given country's economy creditworthy or grant it junk status, making it extremely difficult for that nation to borrow from both private and public lenders. Structural adjustment programs were built on the premise that debtor countries had to repay their debt in hard currency, pushing them to an exports at all costs policy as the only way they could earn the foreign currency. For developing countries, this meant that they had to produce more cash crops for export, in many cases at the expense of growing subsistence staple food crops. This development encouraged an exodus of peasant farmers from the rural areas to the cities for better economic opportunities. The fundamental objectives of the SAPs were to liberalize the national economy by promoting free movement of capital and opening up local, often fragile markets to international competition. SAPs also ensured complete privatization of public services and companies, deregulation of labor relations, and the cutting off of social safety nets with the view of improving competitiveness. For a given country to qualify for new loans from the World Bank and IMF, it has to agree to a prescribed set of conditions. Governments were expected to reduce deficits through cuts in public spending, a process known as cost recovery, where the state gradually withdraws from supporting basic health and educational services. They are to liberalize and relax foreign exchange mechanisms, investment, and trade rules. They were also expected to deregulate labor laws. This was meant to discourage the right to collective bargain for provisions like the cost of living adjustment clause and the minimum wage, abolish price controls and food subsidies, and shift from import substitution to export-oriented production. These measures placed countries on an uncertain path towards deregulated market economies. The World Bank and the IMF also determine the country's macroeconomic policies by taking over its central bank's policies and public spending through public expenditure reviews. While there are claims of the structural adjustment program's success, at least in statistical terms, there are many who dispute the effectiveness of the program. It is yet to be seen how the SAPs create wealth and foster economic development in recipient countries. Unregulated markets do not protect and benefit the local and fragile businesses or the delivery of social services like healthcare and education. Several countries were skeptical from the onset about a neoliberal agenda, and they were forced to abandon socialist or social democratic ideals. They were instead kept in a straitjacket, preventing them from having and implementing dissenting economic programs. In the year 2000, the Bretton Woods Project admitted in an internal World Bank report that the poor are better off without structural adjustment programs. But the admission fell short of addressing the real reasons why the poor have benefited less from the structural adjustment programs. Instead, the report insinuated that the poor may be ill-placed to take advantage of new opportunities created by the structural adjustment reforms, that they neither have the skills nor financial resources to benefit from the high technology jobs and cheaper imports. But structural adjustment programs in the first place meant deep cuts in areas such as food, subsidies, and social services such as health and education. This resulted in worsening the living conditions of the poor and their fair shot at upward mobility on the economic ladder. It is therefore an inconceivable notion that the bank would instead subtly blame the poor for not benefiting from the structural adjustment programs. In recent years, developing countries have now looked elsewhere to forge new trade, business relationships, and access loans for development on much better terms than those of the IMF and World Bank. The China Development Bank committed 110 billion United States dollars in 2009 and 2010 to developing economies and companies, while the World Bank only committed $100 billion from mid-2008 to mid-2009. As a result of the 2008 global economic meltdown, financing for development loans from the West became very tight, and China took advantage of its huge cash chest to wield more influence in the global economy. China has created trade and business deals, thereby emerging as the leading alternative lender to developing countries. There were cause for jubilee. At the turn of the new millennium, leaders from 189 countries met in the United States in September of 2000, the largest gathering of world leaders in history. They assembled to make a commitment to implement a set of development standards, which they called the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs. The resolution was made and a pledge to spare no effort to free our fellow men, women, and children from the abject and dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty and free the entire human race from want by the year 2015. The goals were to achieve having the number of people halving half of the number of people who live in extreme poverty, defining as living on less than $1 a day, providing equal and full access to primary and secondary schooling for all genders, reducing child and maternal mortality, to halt and reverse the spread of HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, the ensuring of environmental stability, provision of access to safe drinking water, and addressing the particular problems of the poorest countries, including unsustainable debt levels. Faith-based and not-for-profit organizations and civil society at large formed an international movement called the Jubilee 2000 Coalition, present in about 60 countries with millions of supporters. Its main goal was to lobby for a total cancellation of unsustainable debt owed by developing countries to Western countries and financial institutions by the world's poorest nations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Jubilee 2000 was convinced that without total debt cancellation, the goals of the Millennium Development would be futile because for every dollar Africa received in aid, it paid back $2.50 in debt servicing. Jubilee is a religious concept derived from Judeo-Christian faith. It means that in the 50th year, called Jubilee, communities are restored or made whole again by forgiving those enslaved by debt, and those who lost their land because of being indebted are given back their land. Jubilee 2000 was about projecting a human face to the devastating effects of third world debt. Zambia's church leaders in 1998 said, "Our incurring debt has not primarily been our fault, and hence forgiveness is not what we are seeking, but justice." Dr. Adabayo Adedeji at the African Center for Development Strategy said that debt is tearing down schools, clinics, and hospitals, and the effects are no less devastating than war. And the All Africa Conference of Churches said, every child in Africa is born with a financial burden which a lifetime's work cannot repair. The debt is a new form of slavery, as vicious as the slave trade. The Jubilee 2000 coalition argued that Africa's debt had already been paid back. Between 1970 and the year 2000, Africa received about $440 billion in loans and paid back $550 billion. But Africa's debt stock still remained at a staggering amount of $295 billion. For every single dollar spent on debt servicing was a dollar less spent on healthcare, education, access to clean water, decent and adequate housing, and the fight against HIV/AIDS. It was estimated that a commitment of $18 billion a year would reverse the HIV/AIDS pandemic that claimed about 7,000 lives per day in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa alone spent almost $13 billion annually in debt servicing to wealthy nations. Wherever some debt was cancelled, tangible and encouraging results were noticed in recipient nations when the money initially meant for debt servicing was spent on essential services like healthcare and education. For example, Uganda more than doubled a school enrollment for children, while Mozambique was able to vaccinate 500,000 children from deadly diseases. In Tanzania, almost 1.5 million children returned to school almost overnight when school fees were eliminated after the country received some debt cancellation. In 2005, Zambia was able to hire 4,500 more teachers and was able to increase the provision of free medical care among the rural population. In some cases, the loans gotten by developing countries helped to empower and enrich dictatorships, but it is the ordinary people that eventually suffer the consequences of repaying the debt. In Indonesia, the dictator Suharto stole $10 billion of the $30 billion lent by the World Bank to his nation. Thank you for listening and watching. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Joshua Ngoma podcast. Bye for now until next time.